Thank you, Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, it may be that there are some profoundly blind people here today. I don't know that there are, but there may be. And if there are, first I must greet you as fellow citizens of this strange, dark city that we inhabit together. Next, I must say that we blind people are as different from each other as sighted people are, and why not? So what I have to say, I say from my own experience of blindness. If I also happen to speak for you, I am content. I was born and brought up in Australia. I first lost my sight at the age of 13 when I developed cataract. Following cataract, I had a long series of detachments of the retina, which led to me losing the sight of my left eye at about the age of 17. Oops, sorry. Oh, there it is. Where was I? Yes, the age of 17. I then had further detachments of the right eye over many years. It gradually deteriorated, and in 1980, when I was a senior lecturer in the University of Birmingham, I had a final series of operations on the right eye, which by now was very seriously traumatized, and I was registered blind. Now, although I was now a registered blind person, I continued to have what they called a little bit of mobility vision. That means that if I was in a room during the day and there was a window and you passed between me and the window, I would see a slight flicker of a shadow as you walked between me and the window. It was that amount of light, very little, but it was useful. That amount of light gradually faded. And around about 1982, 1983, it was so slow I can't tell exactly when, the final little bits of light disappeared. I then found myself in a qualitatively different world. To tell you the truth, I was not interested in blindness. I hardly gave it a second thought. That's because I was too busy coping. I was madly learning new tricks. I was learning how to walk from my home to my office without going under a bus. I was learning how to manage a committee meeting and to cope with the papers, which I would have had to read and partly memorize the previous day. I was learning how to lecture without notes, and that was scary. I mean, scary for the students. Life was full of so many challenges. Learning how to make a cup of tea, learning how to put your tie on. I was so busy with all of these things, and I suppose I had a fairly robust approach towards blindness. Your eyes, I thought, are just a convenient visual aid situated in your head. If they pack up, you make other arrangements. This simple view of blindness. Blindness, I thought, is when you can't see. It was not until that final little bit of light sensation faded altogether that I began to take an interest in blindness. And at this stage, I realized something quite profound. To me it was, anyway. I realized that in the past 2 or 3 years, I had not been a blind person. I had been a sighted person who couldn't see. And that's quite different. Now, I began to enter into deep blindness. What I mean by that is that visual memory began to disappear. I began to forget what I looked like myself. Now, don't smile. Yes, okay, there's some things about blindness aren't so bad. But it was disorientating. I began to feel that I didn't exist. I felt as if I was becoming a sort of a ring wraith. Where was I? I found myself feeling my face to make sure I was still there. More seriously, however, the faces of other people began to disappear. And at this stage, I was haunted by a sort of a daymare. You know, they're worse than nightmares. A little daymare in which I was visiting the National Portrait Gallery, and as I walked along the pictures, each with their little label beneath them telling the name of the person, I would come to a blank on the wall where the portrait had been removed. Underneath was just the nameplate. And this was my way of visually making it clear to myself that the people in my world were now in two categories. There were those who had faces. They were the ones I knew before I lost my sight. And there were those I met now, since I lost my sight. They had no faces. They had elbows. I'm a bit of a specialist in the elbow, as a matter of fact. Well, I'm elbow promiscuous. But they had no faces. So what were people without faces? So intense was my desire to know the face of a stranger, someone I was meeting for the first time, that vivid pictures of the person's possible face would flash through my memory so rapidly that I could hardly concentrate on what they were saying. Slowly, slowly, that also began to fade. Now I found not only had memory of particular faces began to fade, the category that people looked like something at all began to fade. I began to lose the memory that things looked like anything. I found myself called with a slightly abrupt sense of surprise when people would say to me, "John, would you like to know what I look like?" Look like? Oh, yes. That's something that's quite important to sighted people, isn't it? And I would struggle to remember what it was. Of course, I could easily remember, but I'm trying to make the point that I had moved beyond that point. Now, we all go blind in our own personal ways. And I can't explain this experience to you without becoming very personal. So you have to forgive me for that. But there's no other way of doing it. When I became a registered blind person, I had just remarried a year earlier. And when the faces began to disappear, and my own face began to disappear, and I was now frightened at the thought that one day I would go back to the National Gallery and there'd be a sign on the door saying closed. No portraits left, sorry. Everything gone into storage. I was afraid of that day. Now, I was already beginning to forget what my wife's face looked like. That may seem hard to believe, but it's... You see, the face is so mobile. It's so changeable. And the charisma of eye glances is so rapidly changing. I found it difficult to remember. But there were certain photographs I could remember. And at that stage, when all the faces were going, I said to myself, this is one face I will never forget. I will, like Israel was saying, I didn't know much about memory in those days. I thought, I will take that photograph, I will nail it in the deepest part of my heart, and nobody will ever take it from me. My dear friends, I changed my mind. I'll tell you how I came to change my mind. One day, one night, I was at a party with some friends, and one of my old friends came up to me, a man I'd known for years, a good friend, and he said to me, "John, there's something I think you should know." "What is it?" I said. "I think you should know," he said, quite gently, "that Marilyn is looking particularly beautiful tonight." Now, I don't know how you would have reacted. I was furious. I thought, how dare this man put his eyes on my wife and have the nerve to come here and tell me she looks beautiful. I could have hit him, except I'm not the guy that goes around hitting people. And anyway, it's risky when you're blind. Hit the wrong guy. But I remembered what he said, and that was not all. He continued. "You see, John," he said, in a way, you are lucky. You will never see those little wrinkles, those first grey hairs. To you, she will always be young and beautiful. I told Marilyn about this afterwards, and she said, "Well, it's a funny thing, but some of my women friends have been saying something similar. You see, Marilyn, in a way, you are lucky. John will never see you grow old. He will always imagine you the way you are now. You will be forever fresh in his memory." This experience created a profound crisis in our relationship. Not a crisis of love or of trust, of course, but I might call it a crisis of worlds. A somewhat similar experience happened with one of our children. One of our little boys, a little chap of about 18 months, was playing on the carpet with one of Marilyn's friends. When the friend had gone, Marilyn turned to me. I remember this so well. Do I? Israel has made me doubt. She turned to me and said, "What does Joshua mean to you?" And I was embarrassed. I knew what she was driving at. So I bluffed a bit. I said, "Well, you know, Joshua is that bouncing little bundle of boyhood that I throw over my shoulder and I tickle him and he kicks. He's that beautiful, warm little face that I touch when he's asleep." "Yes," she said impatiently, "but what does he look like?" I had to say, "Darling, you know that he doesn't look like anything to me." And then she said, "But I feel as if my friend and I share a Joshua that you don't share." So I said, "But if we don't share the same Joshua, how can we share the same world?" And now I was deep into a change of world. I had to decide how I would live in this new world. How would I relate to the woman I loved? Must I thought, must I always go down nostalgic detours? Must I always seek knowledge in memories which no longer correspond to reality? And I said, no. I will sacrifice nostalgia for reality. I will forget. I will forget those pictures, forget those once treasured images. I will live in reality. I will become a blind person and learn to live in a blind world. That process of discovering that world took years. It was a very strange experience. You see, when at first I lost my sight, and for the following years, I experienced a loss of world. People do think, as Israel said, that when you lose one sight, your other senses move in to compensate. I found that that was not the case. I found I couldn't hear people as well when I couldn't see them. I didn't really understand the degree to which so much of our communication depends upon body image, facial expression, the charismatic interplay of glances. Take that away and you just can't hear people so well. Indeed, I got to think that my world of sense was a bit like my front door. On this door, there were all sorts of bits of metal. There was a letterbox. There was a number for the house. There were hinges. And there was a door knocker. Now, it wasn't just as if the door knocker had dropped off. The whole door had caught fire. And all the elements, all the metal bits and pieces, once so carefully set out in space, had collapsed in the dust. I had to somehow be reborn. And at this stage, I began to realise blindness is not just something that happens to your eyes. It is not just something that happens to your brain. It is something that happens to your whole body. I began to think I've become kind of primitive. Advanced people have specialised organs of sight. I'm like a primitive sort of amoeba. It doesn't have any specialised sense of sight. It sees with its whole body. Its whole organism reacts to its environment. And I thought of myself, that's what I am. I'm a whole body seer. A whole body seer. But that was not all. I discovered not only blindness made my whole body blind, but blindness was also a world. Bit by bit, the elements of a world began to reassemble. It was slow, it was painful, it was full of amazing discoveries. In the early years of my blindness, I frequently could not remember at the end of a day when I'd been speaking with a colleague whether I had been face to face or maybe it was on the telephone. I just couldn't remember. And the reason for that is when a sighted person remembers a conversation with somebody, you remember it against a frame of where that conversation took place. You see your friend against the bookcase or walking around on the lawn, And it's in that context, there's no question of where you were when you had that conversation. I found I had no such framework. I could not place the conversation. Had I been with the person, or was it just on the telephone? Gradually, tactile images, three-dimensional, non-visual, tactile images began to take the place of the visual ones. For example, I say to myself, was I with the person or was it on the phone? Now, I have a three-dimensional tactile memory of holding a hot coffee cup. Therefore, he was with me face to face. Or, no, I have a three-dimensional tactile memory of holding my mobile phone in my hand. Therefore, we were talking on the telephone. The tactile memories gradually took over. I discovered so many beautiful things. For example, trees came back. I used to love trees, the forests, the greenery. Now stars had gone, clouds had gone. The horizon was no more. But now I gradually discovered trees came back. They came back acoustically. Now don't misunderstand me, dear friends. There's nothing a blind person can do that a sighted person can't do. But on the whole, blind people don't bother because they're too busy. Also, sight swamps out all their other senses. I discovered that in the winter, the trees whistled and cracked and hissed. In the spring, they became all fluffy. In the summer, they were like the rolling ocean waves as the wind swept across them. In the autumn, they became all tinkly. And once again, I could tell where the road was as the little leaves were blown along it by the wind. I discovered the beauty of standing beneath a cluster of trees in the full summer and of hearing those millions of little voices talking to each other. And I thought, how incredibly beautiful that is. Why did I never notice it before? At first, as a sighted person, I'd used my hand to do things with. As a blind person, I began to use my hands to know things with. Because as they say, blind people see with their fingertips. Gradually, I learnt also with my hands to appreciate beauty, little beauties, to feel the wonderful circle of a coffee cup as I lay my hand upon it, to feel the incredible beauty of a table with its edges and its corners, little beautiful things that sighted people wouldn't waste their time on, to me became so rich. Above all, I learnt to enjoy the rain. Now, there's a film company represented here today, Fee Fi Fo Films, who are making a film of my early diary of blindness, and we're going to show a little clip now of my experiences of the rain. Thank you.
Rain brings out the contours of what's around you. Instead of being preoccupied internally, you're presented with the world. You're related to a world. You are addressed by a world.
Finished? This experience of blindness has taught me many things. It has taught me that there are several human worlds. I discovered that sighted people on the whole don't realise that they live in a world which is a projection of their sighted bodies. They just think that the sighted world is the world. Therefore, people that don't live in their world must be without a world. Blind people are therefore worldless. I feel that this is one of the reasons for the misunderstanding and the unwanted compassion with which blind people often find themselves treated. I discovered that in order to unite the human family, we have to go to wholeness through plurality. If we go too quickly to unity, we finish up with the totality of the dominant, with the one world created by the powerful. But to obtain one real world, we have to integrate all the many worlds, the many human worlds. And going through that plurality, we can at last achieve the humanness, the one human world which lies beneath all the worlds and ties them all together. Thank you, everybody.